Just because a story is difficult to tell does not mean that we should not tell it. So last Wednesday, a 14-year-old student of Appalachian High School in Winder, Georgia, brought with him a semi-automatic rifle that had been given to him by his father to school that day. And the 14-year-old got up in the middle of class and left the classroom. The door locked behind him because they automatically do so. And when he came back, he knocked at that door to get back into the classroom. And the student, his classmate who went to the door to answer the door, happened to see him out there in the hallway holding that AR-style rifle that his father had given him, and so did not let him into that classroom, but rather backed away from the door and started the protocols that had been drilled into the students each year so they knew what to do. But the fact that he didn't get into that classroom did not deter this 14-year-old who simply turned and went to a different one and started shooting people. And when he was done shooting people, there were 4 people dead, 2 teachers and 2 students. And there were 9 others that had been wounded. And now, the students and teachers and family members and community and so many people now have this as part of our story. And it's hard to tell, and it's hard to hear, but I believe with all my heart that we should tell difficult stories. We need to, in fact. So many stories, so many individual stories. You have probably heard dozens of them if you've been listening. Like the story of Ethan Clark, who sent a text message to his mom. I'm sure all the students did, but this is one that Aaron Clark shared. The text came in, "School shooting, RN," which means right now. And right after that, simply, "I'm scared," followed by the letters PLS, which means please. I'm not joking. And Ethan's mom texted back immediately, "I'm leaving work." His reply was just, "I love you." Love you too, buddy, baby. Baby. And then where are you? And his reply is class, immediately followed by the words, "Someone's dead." Always going to be a part of their story now. Or the kid named Marquez, he's also 14 years old. He stood up on that day, that Wednesday, he stood up in front of television cameras from national news networks, and he told us what he had seen. "When I got up," he said, "I had saw one of my classmates on the ground, bleeding so bad." 14 years old. Ariel Bowling, who's a sophomore there, said, "I just feel like you're basically never safe anywhere." And Ariel's mother, who was also being interviewed, said, "Now how can I ever get her to go to school? She told me she's never coming back here. I just don't know what to do." The teacher, the story goes, who stood up and placed her body in between 2 different 14-year-olds to to save one of the 14-year-old's life, and hers was taken. So many stories, so hard to hear, so hard to tell. The temptation here is to gloss them over. The temptation here is to ignore them, pretend they didn't happen. It is so much easier to tell happy stories. It's so much easier to tell fun stories, stories about good things happening. But church, it is just as important to tell the stories that are hard to hear, to tell the stories that are hard to talk about, to tell the story of, for example, gun-related killings as compared to the total number of homicides, where you hear things like in England, where the gun-related homicides comprise 4% of all homicides, or Australia, where gun-related homicides comprise just 11% of all homicides. In Canada, that percentage is high. It's 40% of all homicides are gun-related. In the United States of America, that percentage is 80%. Yeah, they're numbers, but they tell a story that we might rather not hear, but a story that is so profoundly important to tell. Psychologists understand the importance of telling difficult stories. In the journal and the website Psychology Today, Dr. Deborah Serrani writes about the importance of storytelling, and she says this, quote, "Research has long shown that the key to healing from traumatic stress is the telling of your own story. While it may not be easy to revisit the sights, sounds, and psychic memories of your trauma, it will help you heal." Telling the story that's difficult to tell is not just about understanding, but it's about, as she says, quote, "a reorganization of our sense of self." We reorganize our sense of self in the retelling of difficult stories. When we face trauma, when we face that kind of stress, it puts our body immediately into emergency mode, fight, flight, or freeze. And unprocessed, that level of trauma can lead to long-term issues, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health is impacted if we don't process what we feel. Dr. Serrani says, "A self that was wounded, broken, frightened, or lost can be reclaimed." In the power of telling your story, you are allowed to be transformed and transform what is foreign into what is familiar. You make the unspeakable speakable. Sometimes I hear people say, "Well, I just don't listen to the news. I just avoid it. It's too much." And I completely understand. Stories of grief, stories of suffering, stories of struggle, they are hard to hear. We have to hear them, friends. We have to tell them. We have to hear them. I swear, if I hear one more person say, "Now is not the time to discuss," I'm going to throw a brick at somebody. I don't know what to tell you. This is the time. Every time, all time is the time. We have to tell these stories. We have to talk about the communal trauma that we all experience, because we tell stories in order to live. And that's not just happy stories, that's not just fun stories. We tell stories in order to live. Not telling a difficult story, ignoring a difficult story, it's like ignoring a part of ourself. It's like denying who we are, and even though they're not happy stories, even though they're difficult to hear, difficult to tell, we tell them anyway. We have to. This is a story about two brothers. Adam and Eve had to leave the garden, and they knew they could never go back. So they walked together through the wilderness until they came to a place where there was a little water, the grass was a little greener, and there were a few trees growing. And they planted their own garden there, and they built a home. And then they started a family. They had a son, named him Cain. He was their firstborn. He was their pride and joy. They provided him everything that he needed, and they were so happy together. And Abel added to their happiness when he came along. Cain loved to play with his little brother, and Abel absolutely adored Cain. Since he was older and bigger, stronger and faster, Cain would always outplay Abel and outrun Abel and outwrestle Abel, but Abel didn't care. Cain was his big brother. Big brothers can do no wrong. Cain and Abel grew up together, and they had different jobs. Because Cain was the firstborn son, he worked alongside their father, tending the field. He tilled and planted and weeded and harvested right by Adam's side. One day, this land would be his. And as the heir of the family farm, he had a stake in keeping the land healthy and producing fruit for years to come. Abel, however, shepherded the family's flocks. That's what the youngest son usually did. He spent his days leading the goats and sheep from the fold to the watering holes and grazing meadows around their home. And even though some days were hours and hours of walking in the hot, dry desert, he didn't mind so much. It was his job, his role in the family. He was proud of it. One day, the brothers decided to tell God thank you for their home, for their family, their lives. God had not yet given any instruction as to how they ought to express gratitude or worship or anything like that. So they decided to offer God gifts. Gifts that came from their lives, that represented them. So Cain gathered some wheat, barley, some olives and grapes, and figs from the fields and brought them to God. And God received Cain's gift and said, "Thank you, Cain." Abel also brought gifts. He brought lambs and goats from his flocks to give to God. And when God saw Abel's gifts, God said with admiration, "Well, well, well, what have we here? Nicely done, Abel. What a wonderful gift you've given to me today. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, thank you." And that made Abel smile, but not Cain. Cain heard how God liked Abel's offering better than his. And it puzzled him at first, since he had always been the bigger, better brother. And then it started to make him angry. Why was God lavishing so much attention on Abel? I'm the oldest, thought Cain. God should like my gift better. And he started to think about it more and more. He couldn't stop thinking about it, actually. It crowded out every other thought. He wondered if maybe he wasn't as good as he had thought. If maybe because God liked Abel's gift better, that meant God liked Abel better. And if God likes Abel better, then what does that mean about me? He thought. He was embarrassed, humiliated. He couldn't even look his family in the eye anymore. Walked around all day with his head hung in his shame. Well, of course, God noticed. And God asked Cain, "Why are you moping around like this? What's wrong?" "I was just showing Abel some love. I think he deserves that, don't you?" And besides, your offering was fine. You'll have more chances to make offerings like that down the road, but I'm really concerned about the way you're acting right now. It seems like you're in a pretty bad place. If something doesn't change, you might just do something that there's no coming back from. But nothing changed. Cain allowed his anger and his shame and his wounded pride to get the better of him. And one morning, he woke Abel up and said, "Hey, brother, come with me." And Abel went with him because he always went with Cain when Cain called him. They walked away from their home and over the hill to the field that Cain knew so well. Abel followed him a few steps behind, trusting his big brother had things under control. Cain stopped. Abel stopped. Cain turned around, faced his brother. He bent down slowly, picked up a rock. He wasn't thinking. He wasn't even really seeing his brother. Red, raw emotion distorted every sense, every thought. Gripping the rock, he raised it up over his head and swung with all his strength. He hit Abel in the temple. Abel fell to the ground and did not move. Cain had never seen anyone die before. The rock fell from his trembling hand, and he ran. He ran, and he ran, and he ran. He ran until he fell exhausted in the bottom of a dry creek bed, and God found him there. And God asked him, "Cain, where is your brother?" At first, Cain couldn't say anything. His mouth was dust dry. And finally, "How should I know? I'm not his keeper. Isn't that your job?" Oh, Cain. Oh, Cain, what did you do? God's voice was trembling, heavy with grief. "Of course I know where he is, Cain. Of course I know. His blood is screaming at me, crying out from the ground for justice. You've poisoned this ground, Cain. It will no longer bear fruit for you. It will be barren, desolate. Your brother's blood has made it so." God paused, jaw set, brow furrowed. The silence was thick. And then God said, "And you are no longer welcome here. It breaks my heart, but you have to go. Just go. Go away and don't come back." Cain caught his breath. "Oh God, no, don't send me away. That's too much. Don't leave me alone. I'll die. You've killed me." And God held up the divine hand. No, Cain, stop. I didn't say that. I didn't say that you'd be alone. You're mine. And I'm not going to leave you. You can't stay here, but I will go with you. I will go with you, and I will keep you safe. And God reached out and caressed Cain's cheek, and with God's other hand held Cain's face gently, lifting his eyes to meet God's own. "You are mine, Cain. I love you. And my love has marked you forever. Wherever you go from here, my love will go with you to protect you, to strengthen you, to save you. What you did was terrible. I'm not really sure how to convince you how terrible it was. And you will definitely be facing the consequences of that. But I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to leave your side. I love you. And I'll be with you anywhere you are every day for as long as you live. And so Cain left, grieving, broken, and heavy with his own failure, but alive and marked forever with God's love. Now, Walter Brueggemann says of this story, like the narrator, we must resist every effort to explain it. Because stories are told, but they're not explained. You just hear the story and you follow wherever it leads. Sometimes trying to explain the story limits what the story can actually do. The good news is that God hears our stories all the time. Every story, God hears our stories. The good news is we are all marked by God's love. That God listens to us, even our pain, even our struggle, our most difficult stories. God hears them and responds. God heard Cain's story, as hard as it may have been to hear. In Genesis 16, God hears Hagar's story of mistreatment at the hand of Abraham and Sarah and shows Hagar grace. Her son Ishmael, his name actually means God hears. In Exodus 3, God hears the pain in the story of the Hebrew people enslaved in Egypt and says, I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I have heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. And God acts to liberate the people and bring them to the promised land. In Psalm 34, the suffering person cried out, the Lord listened and saved him from every trouble. God hears us. God hears our stories. God hears our struggle, our pain, and God caresses our face as God listens to these stories, especially stories that are hardest to tell. And God loves us in the telling of them. The church, at its very best, should be a place where we are safe to tell our most difficult stories. The church at its very best should be a community where we can trust that we will be heard without judgment or condemnation. The church at its very best is a community in which we listen to one another, not to judge, not to fix things, but just to hear and to respond with the grace of our presence. There are some stories that are very difficult to tell. It's okay. Tell them anyway. There are some stories that are very hard to hear. It's okay. Listen anyway. Tell your story and listen to your neighbors, knowing that each of us is marked forever with God's love. May the words of my mouth, the meditation of our hearts, be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.